"This land belongs to us too." Those were the words that changed everything in that autumn of 1872. The sun rose slowly over the Dry Creek Valley, painting golden the barren hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a morning like any other for Samuel Morrison, but something in the air brought a different uneasiness. The wind blew stronger than usual, raising small swirls of red dust that danced among the cacti and sage bushes. Samuel walked across the porch of his wooden home, taking in the vastness of his property in the Arizona Territory. At the age of 53, he knew every stone, every Joshua tree, every depression in the terrain of those lands he had called his own for more than 20 years. His calloused hands held a cup of hot coffee, the steam mingling with the still, cool morning desert air. The property stretched for miles in all directions, from the Superstition Mountains to the plains of the Salt River Valley. It was a place where silence reigned supreme, broken only by the occasional mooing of longhorn cattle or the rough singing of a roadrunner running through the bushes. The distant mountains seemed to be eternal guardians of that land forgotten by time, where the seasons blended in an endless succession of scorching days and starry nights. But that morning something was different. Samuel first noticed the strange behavior of the mustangs in the corral. They were restless, huffing and puffing their hooves on the parched floor. Then it was the absolute silence of the coyotes that caught his attention. Not even the wind made its usual noise through the cracks in the pine wood. It was then that he saw them. Two figures approached along the dusty path from the direction of Tombstone, walking with firm and determined steps. From a distance, they looked like mirages created by the heat that was already beginning to form on the horizon of the Sonoran Desert. But as they approached, Samuel realized that they were real, very real. They were two women of impressive stature, taller than anyone Samuel had ever met in his years in the territory. His clothes were simple, made of thick fabric and faded by the relentless Arizona sun, but there was something majestic about his posture. They walked side by side unhurriedly, as if that land belonged to them by natural right. Samuel stepped down from the porch, his pioneering instincts alerting him to something he couldn't identify. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep sense that his life was about to change forever. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands began to tremble slightly like cottonwood leaves in the wind. The two women stopped at a respectful distance from the wooden and adobe house. The eldest, with gray hair tied in a simple bun, raised her right hand in a gesture of greeting, typical of the tribes of the region. His eyes were a deep blue, like the sky at the end of the evening over the desert, and they carried an ancient wisdom that made Samuel feel small. The youngest, with dark hair that fell over her shoulders, maintained an equally dignified posture. There was a serenity in them that contrasted with the restlessness that Samuel felt growing inside his chest. It was as if they brought with them the weight of untold stories and truths long forgotten in the lands of the West. The desert wind stopped completely. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that was about to happen. Samuel knew, without understanding how, that this moment would mark a division in his life, a before and after that would never come together again. It was then that the older woman opened her mouth and uttered the words that would echo in her mind for the days to come. "This land also belongs to us." His voice was soft but charged with unquestioning authority, like the distant rumble of thunder announcing a storm yet to come over the mountains of Arizona. Samuel felt the ground move beneath his feet, though he knew it was only his perception that had changed. Everything around him remained the same endless blue sky, the same Superstition Mountains in the distance, the same house he had built out of pine wood and adobe. But nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed that meeting passed like a strange fog for Samuel Morrison. The two women had not left after uttering those words. They simply remained there, settling on a small elevation about half a mile from their home, where they set up a simple but organized camp. Samuel watched from a distance, trying to understand what was happening. They made no threatening movements, did not approach their cattle, did not interfere with their daily activities. They just stood there, as if waiting for something that only they knew what it was. Early in the morning he could see them walking around the grounds, surveying the ground, touching the trees, as if they were rediscovering a long-forgotten place. Curiosity began to consume Samuel in a way he hadn't experienced in years. All his life in the Arizona Territory, he had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. The West was a place where each person's past was respected as private territory. But there was something about these two women that defied all the unwritten rules he knew. On the third morning, Samuel made a decision that surprised himself. He saddled his horse and rode toward the two women's camp. The sun was already high, creating heat waves that distorted the landscape in the distance. The sound of hooves on the dry ground echoed through the silent valley. When he got close to the camp, Samuel could better observe how they had settled down. It was a simple but efficient arrangement. A small tent made of sturdy canvas, a circle of stones where they made fire, some basic utensils arranged with military precision. There were no horses, there was no cart. How they had gotten there remained a mystery. The older woman saw him approaching and walked towards her. Up close, Samuel could notice details that the distance did not reveal. His hands were large and strong, with calluses that spoke of years of hard work. His feet were disproportionately large, even for his impressive height. There were old scars on his arms, marks that told stories that Samuel could not imagine. She stopped a few steps away and watched him with those piercing blue eyes. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was no submission either. It was the look of someone who knew his place in the world and did not ask permission to occupy it. Samuel dismounted from his horse and stood there, holding the reins, not knowing exactly what he had come to do. The situation was unlike anything he had faced in his years on the frontier. It was not a common land dispute. It was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was something completely new. The younger woman approached as well, walking with the same silent dignity. Together they formed a towering presence that made Samuel feel small, not only physically, but in a way that touched something deep in his soul. It was as if they carried with them the weight of generations, the wisdom of times he could not even imagine. It was then that Samuel noticed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about those lands. On the ground around the camp, there were strange marks on the earth. They were no ordinary human footprints, but deep and wide impressions that seemed to have been made by feet of extraordinary size. The marks stretched in various directions, as if they had walked all over the area during the night. The desert wind brought him an aroma he couldn't identify. It wasn't the familiar smell of sage or cacti in bloom. It was something older, deeper, as if the land itself was exuding memories of long-forgotten times. The older woman held out her right hand, showing Samuel something she had picked up from the ground. It was a pottery shard, small and weathered but clearly made by human hands. The designs etched into the surface were unlike any indigenous art Samuel had known. They were strange symbols, geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story in a lost language. Samuel took the fragment in his hands and examined it closely. The weight was different from what was expected, heavier than ordinary pottery. The texture was also unusual, as if it had been baked at temperatures impossible for the technology he knew. As he watched him, a strange sensation invaded him, as if that small piece of clay carried echoes of voices long silenced. When he looked up, the two women were watching him, with an intensity that made him instinctively retreat. There was no threat in their eyes, but there was expectation. It was as if they were waiting for him to understand something fundamental, something that would forever change his perception of those lands he called his own. The sun continued its relentless journey across the Arizona sky, but Samuel felt as if time had stopped at that moment. The pottery shard in his hands seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, connecting him to a history he was completely unaware of. Samuel spent that night unable to sleep, the pottery shard on his kitchen table, gleaming in the dim light of the lamp. Each time I looked at it, new details seemed to emerge from the symbols etched on its surface. It was as if the play was alive, revealing secrets as his mind opened to possibilities he had never considered. At dawn, a discovery awaited him. During the night, while he was struggling with insomnia, the two women had moved. Samuel found new footprints around his estate, an almost perfect circle that encompassed the entire length of his land. It was as if they had walked all night, drawing an invisible boundary that only they could see. The marks on the ground told a story that defied everything Samuel thought he knew about that place. The footprints were not only large, they were impossible. Some measured more than 2 feet in length, pressed so deep into the hard desert dirt that they looked as if they had been made by creatures of extraordinary weight. But the most disturbing thing was that the prints felt old and fresh at the same time, as if time worked differently for these two women. Samuel followed the footprints for hours, mounted on his sturdiest horse. The trail led him through parts of his property that he rarely visited, places where vegetation grew strangely, where cacti took on contorted shapes that looked almost human in the sunlight. There was something different about these areas, an energy that made your horse nervous and its hairs stand on end for no apparent reason. In a natural depression of the terrain, surrounded by rock formations that rose like gigantic fingers pointing to the sky, Samuel found something that made him question his own sanity. It was a perfect circle of stones, each the size of a grown man, arranged with mathematical precision. The arrangement was ancient, so old that lichens had grown on the rocks, creating colorful patterns that looked like maps of unknown constellations. But it wasn't the stones that drew the most attention. In the center of the circle, the earth had been hollowed out, forming a perfectly smooth circular depression. The soil there was different from the rest of the terrain, darker, richer, as if it was constantly nourished by something Samuel could not identify. And around the edge of the excavation there were footprints, lots of footprints, all of the same impossible size that he had found around his house. Samuel dismounted and walked carefully to the edge of the stone circle. The silence there was absolute, deeper than any silence he had experienced in the desert. Not even the wind made noise in that place. It was as if the air itself was waiting for something. It was then that he saw the bones. They were not human bones, nor those of any animal he knew. They were large, larger than buffalo bones, with shapes that did not correspond to any creature he had studied or hunted. They were partially buried in the dark earth at the center of the circle, emerging from the ground as evidence of a story no one had told. Samuel knelt down and carefully dug around one of the bones with his hands. The earth came loose easily, as if waiting to reveal its secrets. As he dug, more bones appeared, forming what appeared to be a partial skeleton of a creature of extraordinary proportions. The skull, when it finally found it, measured almost 3 feet in length. It was clearly human in its basic structure, but magnified beyond any scale it knew. The teeth were still intact, white as ivory, perfectly preserved by the special earth of that place. The eye sockets were deep and wide, as if they had housed eyes capable of seeing beyond what normal human eyes could perceive. While examining the skull, Samuel realized that he was not alone. The 2 women had arrived silently and were now watching him from the edge of the stone circle. They didn't seem surprised that he had found that place. In fact, there was something about their expressions that suggested they had been waiting for this moment. The older woman entered the circle and approached Samuel. She knelt beside him and placed her large calloused hands over the ancient skull. His fingers traced the lines of the bones with a familiarity that spoke of deep, ancient connections. It was as if he were greeting a long-lost relative. Samuel watched as she carefully plucked more bones from the earth, each movement revealing reverence and knowledge. The younger woman also joined them, and together they began assembling the skeleton with a precision that indicated they had done so many times before. What emerged from the earth of the sacred circle was the bone structure of a human being over 9 feet tall. The proportions were perfect, not distorted or deformed, just magnificently magnified. It was as if nature had created a larger, more powerful version of the human form, adapted to a world Samuel could not imagine. As the 2 women worked, Samuel noticed how their own bodies related to the ancient bones. His hands fit perfectly into the cavities of the giant skull. His feet left footprints that exactly matched the marks he had found around his property. The revelation struck him like a thunderbolt. The 2 women were not only tall by ordinary human standards. They were the direct descendants of the race of giants that had once inhabited those lands. The sun began to tilt westward, creating long shadows that stretched across the stone circle. The shadows seemed to bring the assembled bones to life, creating the illusion that the ancient giant was preparing to rise again. Samuel felt a shiver run down his spine, not of fear, but of wonder at the magnitude of the discovery he had made. The older woman stood up and looked straight into Samuel's eyes. At that moment, he understood that his presence there was no coincidence. They had come because it was time for the truth about those lands to be revealed. It was time for anyone to know that long before the settlers, long before the Indian tribes he knew, a race of giants had called that valley home, and their descendants had returned to claim their inheritance. The surrounding mountains seemed to silently witness this moment of revelation. The desert wind finally blew again, carrying with it the ancient aroma that Samuel had smelled in the women's camp. Now he knew what it was, the smell of the earth itself awakening to recognize his lost children. Samuel looked around the stone circle and noticed that there were other similar sites scattered around the hills. Small elevations that he had always considered natural formations now revealed his true identities, tombs and monuments of a forgotten civilization. a race of people who had left their marks engraved on the very fabric of that land. The pottery shard in his pocket seemed to pulsate with renewed heat, as if reacting to the presence of the ancient bones. Samuel removed it and placed it carefully next to the giant skull. The fit was perfect, as if the small piece was part of a much larger container that had once belonged to that extraordinary being. The afternoon turned to twilight as the three remained in the sacred circle, united by an understanding that transcended words. Samuel finally understood why these lands had always looked different, why certain areas of his property had a special energy, why animals sometimes behaved strangely in certain places. He was not the first owner of those lands. It was just the latest in a lineage that stretched much further back in time than any official record could document. And now, the true heiresses had returned, not to take what was his, but to share an inheritance that belonged to all who respected the sacred history of that place. The months that followed that revelation in the stone circle transformed Samuel Morrison's life in ways he could never have imagined. The two women, whom he came to know as Sarah and Rebecca, did not leave as he initially hoped. Instead, they established a permanent presence on the land, building a simple but solid dwelling on the same elevation where they had set up their first camp. Samuel discovered that sharing his land did not mean losing it. In fact, it meant gaining something much more valuable: knowledge. Sarah, the older of the two women, possessed an understanding of land that went far beyond anything Samuel had learned in his 20 years as a landowner. She knew where to find water in times of drought, knew medicinal plants that grew in specific locations, understood the movement patterns of animals in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Rebecca, on the other hand, had practical skills that impressed Samuel on a daily basis. His large, strong hands could mold the clay of the earth into containers of incomparable beauty and functionality. She knew construction techniques that allowed her to create structures that withstood the strongest desert winds without using a single piece of metal. It was as if he carried in his ancestral memory the knowledge accumulated by generations of giants who had prospered in those lands. During the winter, Samuel learned the true history of the valley. Through gestures, drawings in the sand, and especially through direct experience, the two women showed him that this place had been home to a prosperous civilization long before any written record. The stone circles were not just funerary monuments, but centers of a complex network of astronomical and agricultural knowledge. Samuel came to understand that the strange patterns of vegetation growth he had noticed corresponded to ancient irrigation canals, invisible to the untrained eye, but still functional after centuries. The rock formations that I had always considered natural turned out to be structures deliberately shaped to channel wind and water to create ideal microclimates for different types of cultivation. Spring brought a discovery that changed everything. While helping Sarah restore one of the stone circles that had been partially destroyed by a storm years earlier, Samuel found an underground chamber that had remained sealed for decades. Inside, sheltered from the action of time, were artifacts that told the full story of the giants who had inhabited the valley. There were intact pottery vessels, some large enough that Samuel could hide inside them. There were tools made of polished stones with a precision that defied explanation. And there was something else: pictographic records engraved on the stone walls that documented not only the lives of the giants, but also their peaceful interaction with other peoples who had arrived in the valley over the centuries. The drawings showed giants working alongside people of normal height, sharing knowledge, celebrating harvests together. It was not a story of conflict or domination, but of cooperation and mutual respect. Samuel understood then that the arrival of Sarah and Rebecca was not an invasion or hostile claim. It was a return to the ancient tradition of sharing that had been interrupted only by the forced absence of the descendants of the giants. During the summer, Samuel made a decision that surprised even himself. He began to document everything he was learning, not only to preserve the knowledge, but to prepare the way for others to understand the true history of those lands. He wrote at night by the light of the lamp, recording every discovery, every technique learned, every story conveyed through the gestures and actions of his giant companions. Sarah and Rebecca watched his efforts with quiet approval. It was clear that they also understood the importance of preserving that knowledge for future generations. Gradually, they began to guide Samuel in creating a special type of record, combining written words with pictographic symbols similar to those found in the underground chamber. Autumn arrived with an unexpected surprise. Other people began to arrive in the valley, attracted by the stories Samuel had quietly shared during his travels to the city. They were not curious sensation seekers, but genuine scholars, archaeologists, and anthropologists who recognized the extraordinary value of the discoveries that were being made. Samuel watched with increasing satisfaction as Sarah and Rebecca interacted with visitors. There was a dignity in his reception of newcomers that spoke of a profound wisdom about human nature. They did not show off or hide. They were simply themselves, allowing their presence and knowledge to speak for themselves. One of the visitors was a professor at an Eastern university who had dedicated his life to the study of Native American cultures. When he saw the artifacts and heard the history of the valley, his hands trembled with excitement. He immediately understood that he was facing a discovery that would change the understanding of American prehistory. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in Samuel himself. Over the months, he had transformed from a lone owner, concerned only with his flocks and his livelihood, to something very different, a guardian. He now understood that his function was not to own those lands, but to protect and preserve them so that others could learn from them. At the end of that first year of living together, Samuel, Sarah, and Rebecca established a new tradition. At each full moon, they gathered at the main stone circle for a silent ceremony of gratitude. There were no words. There were no complicated rituals. Just three people representing different aspects of humanity, acknowledging their shared connection to the land that sustained them. Samuel had learned that true ownership did not come from legal documents or barbed wire fences. It came from a deep understanding of a place, respect for its history, and a commitment to its preservation. The lands of the valley belonged to him no more than they belonged to Sarah and Rebecca. In fact, it was the other way around. They all belonged to the land. They were part of a continuity that extended far beyond their individual lives. When winter came again, Samuel was no longer alone in his wood, adobe home. The valley had become a low-key center of learning, where respectful scholars came to understand a forgotten part of American history. Sarah and Rebecca had become not only residents but teachers, imparting ancestral knowledge in a way that enriched the understanding of all who had the privilege of learning from it. The last words the two women had uttered at that first meeting finally made complete sense. This land also belongs to us. It was not a claim of exclusivity, but a recognition of mutual belonging. It was a declaration that the earth was big enough to embrace all of its children, as long as they came with respect and understanding. Samuel often sat on his porch at the end of the day, watching the sun set over the mountains. He now knew much better. The valley had not changed physically, but his understanding of it had completely transformed. Each rock formation had a story. Each plant grew in its place for specific reasons. Each animal followed patterns established by generations of harmonious coexistence. And on clear nights, when the stars shone with special intensity over the desert, Samuel could swear he heard distant echoes of ancient wind-blown voices, reminding him that he was only the latest keeper in a lineage that stretched far deeper into time than any recorded history could tell. The land belonged to all of them, and they belonged to the land. It was a simple truth that had taken a lifetime to understand, but it now illuminated each day with a purpose greater than anything Samuel had known before. If this story about Samuel Morrison and the two giant women has touched your heart, you can't miss our next Wild West adventures. Every narrative we create carries the same emotional depth and fascinating mysteries you just discovered. Subscribe to the channel now to receive all our stories as soon as they are published. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single adventure. Your journey through the secrets of the American territory is just beginning.